So how in the world are the cotton fields of the 1930s connected to billion-dollar legal battles in our own century? Well, it's a story about a single crop that basically built a nation's wealth, a government plan that completely upended a way of life, and a debt that we're still trying to figure out today.
To really get this, we have to start with the people who are actually there, living it. These words, they're from a sharecropper in Georgia way back around 1900, and they just perfectly capture this deep feeling of powerlessness that's really at the very heart of this entire story. Okay, so before we can even talk about the New Deal, we've got to grasp the sheer world-changing power of one single plant, cotton. For more than 100 years, this wasn't just farming, it was the engine of the American economy. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. For 134 years straight, one single product drove America's entire trade with the rest of the globe. This thing was a massive, complex business that tied together the money of the American South, the textile mills up north, and all the industrial centers over in Europe. And here's the brutal truth at the center of that economic engine. The incredible profits from what they called white gold were built on the backs of enslaved people. All that wealth didn't just fuel the nation's growth. It made the institution of slavery last longer and get even more intense, leading the country straight into the Civil War. So after the Civil War ends and slavery is abolished, a new system pops up to organize all the work on those same cotton fields. It was called sharecropping. And while it looked different on paper, for so many people, it just became a new kind of trap. In theory, right, sharecropping was supposed to offer millions of newly freed African Americans a real shot at economic independence, like a ladder that could climb out of poverty. They wouldn't have to work in big gangs under an overseer anymore. Instead, they'd manage their own little plots of land and get a piece of the profits. But in practice, it was a trap, for sure. Here's how it worked. It all started with the landowner giving out supplies on credit, but with super high interest. Then, after a whole year of back-breaking work, the landlord would sell the cotton and settle the books. But after he deducted the debt, the sharecroppers would often find out they owed more than they'd earned. And that debt legally trapped them on the land, creating this vicious cycle that was almost impossible to break. All right, let's fast forward to the 1930s. The Great Depression hits, and the price of cotton just tanks, wrecking the whole farming economy. So FDR's New Deal comes in with this massive government plan, a plan that would end up having catastrophic unintended results for sharecroppers. So the idea behind the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, was pretty simple, really. It's just basic supply and demand. The government figured if we pay farmers to not plant so much cotton, the smaller supply will make prices go up, and that'll help out the struggling landowners. And this is where you see this huge gap between what the government wanted to do and what actually happened on the ground. The government checks, they went straight to the landowners. And since they were being paid to produce less, they didn't need as many workers. The result? Landowners evicted their tenant farmers by the thousands, pocketed the government cash, and left the sharecroppers with absolutely nothing. And people saw this happening, A journalist at the time, E. Lewis, he was watching all this unfold. He called the AAA a businessman's solution. He said it was designed perfectly to help the farm owner, but it completely ignored the most vulnerable people in the whole system, the farm laborers who were actually doing the work. So what happens when this whole system just collapses? Well, this collapse of sharecropping, which got a huge push from the AA, and the rise of farming machines, it set off one of the biggest internal migrations in American history, the Great Migration. Over several decades, nearly 6 million Black Americans left the rural South. 6 million. They were basically forced off the land they had worked for generations and pulled towards cities up north and out west, looking for, as the author Richard Wright so beautifully said, the warmth of other suns. And here's something that's just so crucial to get. This wasn't just about people moving. For Black Americans, it was a catastrophic loss of land, and with it, the number one way to build generational wealth in this country. I mean, the numbers here are they're mind-blowing. In 1910, at their absolute peak, Black farmers owned over 16 million acres of farmland. But by 1997, because of a whole mix of things, the AAE evictions, racist loan practices, even just outright violence, they had lost more than 90% of that land. And if you're wondering what that means in today's money, we'll take a look at this.
A conservative study estimated that the land lost or stolen from black farmers is worth over $326 billion today. That's billion with a B. It's a straight line from past policies to the racial wealth gap we see right now.
So, eventually all of this history, all of this discrimination and loss, it had to end up somewhere. And it ended up in a courtroom decades later. So in the late 90s, black farmers filed this massive class action lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It was called Pigford v. Glickman. They argued that for decades, they'd faced systemic discrimination when it came to getting farm loans and assistance. That first lawsuit, it ended in a settlement of over $1 billion. But so many people got left out that they had to file a second one a decade later, which led to another $1.25 billion settlement for tens of thousands more farmers. And that leaves us here with this really big, important question. The Pigford settlements, they were historic, no doubt, but they point to something much bigger. When government policies, whether they mean to or not, end up causing generations of economic damage to one group of people, what does it really mean to repay that debt? It's a question that echoes all the way from those old cotton fields right into the biggest debates we're having today.